Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So this is our second lecture on advanced microeconomics. Allahumma arina haqqa haqqan warzuqna ittaba'ahu wa arina al-batila batilan warzuqna ijtinabahu. So we have been discussing economic theory from an outsider's perspective. What is economic theory? Not from an inside believer's perspective. From a believer's perspective, economic theory is true, and therefore we must understand it, and if we understand it, it will give us the power to understand the world around us. So it's like a magic that if you learn the magic, then you can use it's like a skill. If you learn how to drive, then you can drive a car. But actually, once you look at it from the outside, you see that it is an imaginary theory, and it is built on an imaginary world. So, for example, leading textbook, Krugman and Wells, says that the supply and demand model, which we introduced in the chapter 3 and have used repeatedly, is a model of a perfectly competitive market. And everywhere, in every text, you will find discussion of perfectly competitive markets. All of the theory is derived under the assumption of perfect competition. Now, perfect competition does it exist in the real world? Well, some people have looked into the question. Your textbooks don't actually mention whether or not perfect competition can be found. वो चिड़िया है जो दुनिया में मिलती ही नहीं. So those people like Baumol and Blinder, they actually did a study of markets, and they said, well, we couldn't find any examples of perfect competition in any of the markets we looked at. So there is an article by Barbara Bergmann with the title "Needed a New Empiricism." It's a short article actually, but I just want to... It starts by saying that, biologists made a very interesting discovery about bottlenose dolphins. They found that some of the dolphins do certain types of things, other type, and they are specialized in their jobs. It's not that everyone can do every kind of thing. But how did they find this out? They spent hundreds of hours studying dolphins. Now, economists also have theories about firms, but how much time have economists spent in studying firms? It turns out 0. Economists do not study firms. How do they make up theories? They make up theories by writing axioms. This is how the firms behave. They maximize profits. They have inputs, capital, labor. They have never actually asked any professor who teaches you theory, has he ever looked at a real firm? If you look at any textbook, is there any case study discussing what a real firm is like? Now, sometime in the 80s, I think, some people said, well, why don't we go and look at real world human beings? Do the human beings maximize profits? Do the firms, maximize utility? Do the firms maximize profits? And when they started studying real world, they found that the reality didn't have any match to the economic theory. So then they started publishing their findings, and because these findings were different from the theory, they got a new name. They were called behavioral economists. There is a whole field of economics which is called behavioral economics. What does it mean? Behavioral economics means that these people study the real behavior. Now, isn't this strange? There's theoretical economics which says that, all human beings behave according to certain mathematical formulas, and they never check, do human beings really behave according to these formulas? When they check, they find that they don't. So they said, okay, there's a different field. This is called behavioral economics. This studies the actual behavior. But even stranger, if you look at the economics textbooks, they mention behavioral economics as a footnote. But the real economics is about the theoretical economics, about the formulas. It's not about human behavior. Now the strange thing is that, so if people tell them, people don't behave like what you say. Well, if people are irrational, what can you do? It doesn't matter. Our theory deals with rational behavior. People should learn how to be rational so that they can follow our theories. Now, actually, behavioral economists predicted the global financial crisis 2007. Conventional economists did not. So they got some neighbors, they got some status, prestige, but still they have not made it into the textbooks. And the textbooks don't teach behavioral economics, they teach utility maximization. So there are two core principles. If you read Varian, this is where he starts. That's what I asked you to do. That there are two core principles of economics, maximization and equilibrium. Paul Krugman, who is actually started out very strong neoclassical and has become a little bit less so, but he is still deeply brainwashed into, and he says that I am a little bit open-minded, more than most, but basically I am a maximization and equilibrium. Indeed, I am quite fanatical about it. So if we want to explain the behavior of economic systems, we have to have some principles. This later paragraph, this is taken directly from Varian. This is a quotation from Varian. We have to have a framework, and economics we use a framework built around two simple principles. One is the optimization principle, and the other is the equilibrium principle. So these principles come before any observations. This is very important to understand. You have these axioms, and this is the glasses that you're going to put on before you start looking at the real world. So everything has to have optimization, everything has to have equilibrium. Otherwise you won't study it. Otherwise you don't agree. If I tell you that human being behaves in such a way that there is no equilibrium, you say, that's not economics. That's how they say, that's not economics. It's psychology, it's some other field, but it's not economics. In economics we study behavior, we study equilibrium and optimization. So because of this, Keynes, I already told you that Keynes had a difficult time breaking out of this conditioning which economics gives, and basically he said that classical economists are like Euclidean geometers. In the Euclidean geometry, you have certain axioms. You have you have the parallel postulate. You have that lines are straight, and so in non-Euclidean geometers in a non-Euclidean world, who find that parallel lines should not meet each other, but in non-Euclidean geometry they can touch and cross. So he said that when they find this, then they say, they rebuke the lines. They are angry with the lines. Why are you not keeping straight? You're not following our axioms. So if people don't obey the transitivity assumption, they say you should be rational, not that we should change our theory. So what is wrong with maximization? Well, there is very strong empirical evidence. When you study actual behavior, you find that people don't maximize. This is not the lecture in which I'll focus on it. I might discuss it in detail, but very briefly, something that everybody can understand. You set up a game in which there are some rules, and there are two prizes, and one prize is $9 and the other is $10. Very, very often, depending on how complex the rules are, the subjects, the human beings, will not study the game very carefully to figure out how to gain that $10, and they will end up with the $9 prize when it was possible for them to take the $10 by studying it carefully. People are just either they can be lazy, they are not interested in doing the calculation, they think that $9 is good enough, they don't want to put in all the calculation efforts, or maybe they just can't figure out the rules sufficiently carefully to do the analysis. Economics assume that everybody is hyper-rational. You can do all the calculations that are required to compute the first order derivatives of your utility function in order to calculate the maximum. Maybe you can't calculate that, even if you have such a function. So the empirical evidence says that people don't maximize, they satisfy. They find some solution which is satisfactory and they go with that instead of finding the best possible solution. Paul Krugman, in that same speech which I said earlier, that I'm a maximization and equilibrium, he makes a concession. He says that, when we start looking at these things, we find that situations are so complex that we put our imaginary agents into, that it doesn't seem like you can maximize. There's too many things that you don't know. How can you maximize? So then how would people behave? Well, they would follow some rules. That, okay, if you don't know this and you don't know that and you don't know that, you can't maximize, then there are some rules, some ad hoc rules, which are rather different from maximization. And I will illustrate why we cannot maximize in oligopoly. It's very easy to do, actually. Basically, your maximum depends on what everybody else is doing, and you don't know what everybody else is doing. So how can you maximize? It's very simple. So students are also doing satisfying behavior. I try to motivate them to be the best, and they say, "Oh no, I'm quite happy to be passing student." So I want to say that if you study neoclassical economics, which is what is being taught, you can never be more than second rate. It's very, very hard to, because there is a huge amount of material there, and it's not just mastering the material. You have to have connections. You have to make it to the right universities, know the right people. Studies show that in the top 10 journals, only a certain limited number of people get to publish. And if somebody else submits a paper, then it doesn't get considered. Even it's not the question of quality of paper; it's the question of who knows you. So, what I am teaching you is very different from neoclassical theory, and it is something in which there are very few people, and it is something that is real and that you can master. Unlike the differential equations that you are supposed to learn, which you cannot because you don't really have the mathematical background required to study it. So you can do an imitation, you can learn how to copy those equations, but you cannot really understand what is behind them. But the reality is not built by differential equations. You can understand human behavior much better than the economist, because the economists use mathematical formulas and you have your experience. But what the economist is trying to do is to shut your experience up and say that's irrelevant, apply my math, and then you don't understand your experience and you don't understand human behavior. So then you also say that, okay, those are the specialists and the experts. So, but it is unfamiliar. I am trying to teach you to fly high above, and it's risky, dangerous. Most students would rather just go with what is familiar rather than try something strange and new and different. So it's the same thing. वो फरेब खुर्द शाहीं जो पल्ला हो कर गसों में उसे क्या खबर कि क्या है रहो रस्म शाहबाजी. So you'd rather be with all the crows where they are instead of, because it's risky. It is a dangerous thing. So here is a quote from Keynes again. Basically, Keynes is talking about the power of ideas. That people who think that they are very practical people, they are not visionaries, they are not philosophers, they are actually acting under the influence of philosophical ideas, but they are not aware of it. And so, what we are studying in this course is meta theory, where in every other economics course people are teaching here's what is in the text. We are going to look at what is being taught in text to students all over the world. So this is a higher level view. So, as I said, maximization is not a good hypothesis about how people behave. I have to work very hard to get students to try to maximize. They are quite happy with getting a passing grade. So, the other central principle is equilibrium. Now, equilibrium is old-fashioned concept. I mean, in the 20th century, people started studying what is called dynamic systems. And now what happens in dynamic systems is that they rarely converge to equilibrium. The economics have the picture that we will not study disequilibrium behavior. We will study what happens in the long run, which is when the system converges to equilibrium. But actually, when systems can have equilibrium, but they can fail to converge to it. You can give many examples in economics as well. So, for example, if you have business cycles, they keep going up and down, never converges to equilibrium. Dynamic systems often have multiple equilibria. So now economists believe that there is only one equilibrium. But actually you can use mathematics theory, the same that they do, to prove that most systems that we study, if they have any level of complexity, they will have multiple equilibria. Now, when you have multiple equilibrium, then there are many kinds of behaviors. Some equilibria can be stable, some can be unstable, some can be attractors, some can be repellers, and the system behavior is quite complex and it's always outside of equilibrium. So then basically economics is irrelevant. Like global financial crisis was clearly a disequilibrium. So can you study it using economics? No, because it's not equilibrium. Economists, they start out by saying that we are only going to study equilibrium. That means that you can't study what's happening in the real world. So there's a predator-prey model. If I have the time, I will show you this movie and explain, but I want to go on to the... There is another, there's another line of argument which economists use to justify their modeling. When we tell them that, look, I went to the real world firm and I find that they are not maximizing profits. There are many very solid ways to prove that firms do not maximize profits. So what economists say to that is that, well, you know, if it doesn't maximize profits, it will disappear, because in competition by evolution, only the profit maximizing firms will survive. So that's an evolutionary argument, but they don't really use the argument seriously. So now people have started studying evolutionary economics, and they say, okay, let's put in a lot of different firms, and they have different types of strategies. Some of them are profit maximizers, others are other types. So what will happen? Is it true that the profit maximizer will survive and the others will be driven out? It turns out no. Very often profit maximizers can be destroyed in the evolution, and many different kinds of things emerge. So this is actually a very interesting new field of research, which is done by using agent-based modeling, is one of the best methods, which I had taught here last year, the first semester, I think. And so we have some people who have learned it, and maybe we will teach it to you also later on, not in this course, but so these are new ways of doing economics in which we are not tied to optimization and we are not tied to equilibrium. Actually, one very important point is that the computers were not available so in the past. So these theories that we are studying could not be studied. This is also true in statistics and econometrics. The type of theory that was developed was done because, see, if you have a normal distribution, then you can analyze data by just using two numbers. One is the mean and the other is standard deviation. If the distribution is not normal, then you have to study a lot more numbers. At least you need about 5 numbers about that data to understand it. Now, and calculating those 5 numbers is not easy. So people made the assumption of normality because it made the data analysis easier. Similarly, economists could not analyze disequilibrium behavior. It was not possible. There was no, they didn't know enough math, and the math wasn't there. Now we can do that. So, but the economists are stuck in the paper pencil mode. So if we have computers, we can do a lot more complicated things, and the world is complicated. It can't be, you can't figure out what human beings are doing by writing a formula on a piece of paper. So as I said, economic theory of supply and demand applies only to perfect competition, but the conditions that perfect requires are almost impossible to meet. For one thing, all the agents are price takers. So in fact, there is no competition. And competition occurs when somebody offers a higher price and somebody offers a lower price and you choose. But in the perfectly competitive model, there is no competition. Everyone is price taker. If you want to really study what happens in a competitive market with perfect competition, you have to use evolutionary models. You have to say, okay, people are trying to get the best price and they will make different offers. And actually, I have my students play games. I have a game set up. If we can arrange it for a time, then we can have you play the game so that you can understand what perfect competition actually leads to. There are some very important hypotheses made about perfect competition, which is perfect information. Everybody knows everything, and also zero transaction costs. If I go there to one shop, if I go there to the other shop, there are no costs, there are no externalities, and there is a long list of impossible assumptions. Now the argument economists make is that these are an approximation. These assumptions are an approximation to reality. Well, that's possible, but now the question is, does that approximation give you results which are close to reality, or does it give you results which are far from reality? So there is a lot of evidence which says that even if you relax these assumptions by just a little bit, the picture changes completely. So that this is not, these assumptions don't give you a reliable approximation to reality. So now I'm going to start on the Hill-Myatt anti-textbook. So for economics, he starts by classical study of supply and demand theory, which is done in all texts. So now, instead of studying the textbook theory, we are studying what is taught in textbooks of economics. So we are studying meta theory. So this is what the typical picture that you have seen, since you have also all studied economics. So here there is a demand for gasoline. The demand for gasoline is very inelastic. The demand curve is very highly sloped. Very, very vertical. So when you have inelastic demand, then when the price changes by a lot, the quantity changes only a little, because you need to buy gasoline. So even if people double the price of gasoline, people will keep on buying gasoline because it's necessary. They will reduce it, but it's sort of necessary. But bananas, you can live without. And so if the price, the demand is elastic, and so if the price raises by a lot, you will stop eating bananas. So the quantity change will be a lot. And so this is the standard supply and demand equilibrium, which is actually a fairy tale, doesn't exist in the real world, but you have been made to believe it. So this is the classical picture. You have the supply curve and the demand curve, and there are two situations. If the price is above the equilibrium price, then you have a surplus. The supply is in excess of demand, and what will happen is that since all of these sellers are trying to sell the goods but they don't have the buyers, so they will lower the price. But now there is a little bit of a contradiction here, because the sellers are supposed to be price takers, not price makers. So if they are saying that, okay, price is too high, so I am going to change the price, then they have the option of changing prices. But if they are going to change prices, then they are not acting in the way that the theory says. If this is the way, then you see, there is a market price, and you have two options: you either sell at that price or you don't sell. That's the price taker. Now the price maker goes and sees, okay, things are happening, and what price should I set for my good so that I can sell it? Now, if everybody is setting prices, then there will be a large number of prices in the market. And this is actually what happens when in reality there is a large number of prices. But if you have a large number of prices, then there is no market price, and everybody is a price maker, and you don't have perfect competition. So competition is actually self-contradictory. It doesn't exist because it's logically impossible. The other part of the picture is that you have a shortage if the price is set too low. If the price is set too low, then there is excess demand. People all want to buy this good, but they can't find enough of it, so they bid up the prices because people want to buy, but there's not enough good being sold. So that's the standard story. Now, this is a theory. It's in the books, but what does it do? That's the most important thing. So what are the policy implications of this theory? So some very important examples are rent control. So suppose I decide that, the poor people, the house prices in Islamabad are very high, and so I want to give the poor people a chance, and so I say, okay, nobody can charge more than 10,000 rupees for rent for their houses. So that's a ceiling. So what's going to happen? Well, supply and demand theory gives us an answer to this question. It says that at this point there will be a housing shortage because there will be excess demand. People will reduce their supplies. Many people will say $10,000 is not enough for me to rent the house, and so they will take their houses off the market. And many extra people who could not afford housing, they will come into the market and they will try to rent houses, and so there will be a huge number of excess demanders, and there will be a shortage of housing. So now we go up into the stratosphere. This is what is happening here is a type of argument that is used. It's another kind of invisible hand argument. It is another argument about arguments. So Hegel had this idea about history. Hegel is a very famous philosopher, and his ideas have had a very deep impact on European history. In particular, Karl Marx was one of his students and disciples, and his theories also had a major impact on the world. So the idea of Hegel that is involved here, that we are studying, says that there is an underlying force which is driving history, and that underlying force is reason. And this force doesn't get involved in the battle. It's like the puppeteer. He is moving the strings, but he is not involved in the stage of history. So people in the world, they act according to their own interests, and they are driven by their own passion. But they are all being used for some higher purpose without being aware of this. So this is one of the ideas of Hegel about how history operates. So who was Hegel? Why did he think with his ideas? Who was he opposing? What did he favor? These are all important ideas, but we will bypass them all and we will just take this as a meta idea, which is the basis of the ideas that we are studying. That there are things which are happening, there are forces which are, everybody acts according to their individual purposes, but some bigger things happen which are bigger patterns which are not in control of the individual agents. So our rent control model which the economists do has this effect of a meta-argument. It says that, look, what's happening here is that government is trying to help the poor people. But what they do in order to do that has unintended consequences. The government doesn't want to hurt the poor people, but actually that's what's going to happen. What's going to happen is that a few people will get houses. A large number of people who could have gotten houses are going to be now homeless, or at least they're not going to be able to find houses. And there are many other problems that will happen. So the textbooks that you read are emphasizing that if you try to interfere with the market to try to make things better, you will end up making things worse. So there are 5 problems with rent controls which are discussed in textbooks always, and this is basically learning to think like an economist and think like a normal person. You say, yes, we would like to help the poor, but the economist says that no. Actually, he's not being taught to be immoral, he's being taught that you have to be more intelligent, more wise, more clever. And if you analyze the situation deeply, you understand that there will be excess demand, prices below equilibrium, so there will be a shortage of supply of houses. Houses will not be produced because people will say that we can't get enough pricing out of them. People will not be able to find houses. There will be inefficient distribution of houses. What does this mean? Well, basically it means that some people can afford to pay more for housing. They will not be able to get the house they want. People will, some landlords would want to offer better housing, but they cannot do so. The quality of housing will be, because they don't have enough revenue, quality of housing will be reduced. People will waste time and effort searching for houses, but they will not find houses because there are not enough houses. And then there will be also illegal activities. There will be a black market. People will say, okay, you pay me. Actually, in Karachi, there was something called pagdi, where you had to pay a huge amount of money in advance, and then you had low rents for the remaining amount. So, rent control is an example of a price setting which is below equilibrium. On the other hand, there are minimum wage laws. Again, this is a subject of discussion in most textbooks. Minimum wage is above equilibrium. So, again, this is an attempt to help the poor laborers. You say you should give them enough money so that they can eat and they can feed their family and so on. So the economist said, no, this seems like a logical thing, but actually you, the smart economist, know how to think better than the average person. And so you will find that the wage is above equilibrium, there is excess supply of labor, people want to work but they can't find jobs. If the minimum wage was lower, then more jobs would be created and more people would be able to find jobs. So actually you will help the poor more by allowing the wage to go down. What about the surplus? Okay, some people are getting more at least, but that's going to be distributed to a small number of people who are already employed. The people who don't have jobs will be hurt. So in fact, labor unions are very harmful because what they do is they take the existing wage stock and the laborers and they try to raise their wages. They make those small number of people who are working better off and they hurt all of the people who are not working. So we should get rid of labor unions. So this is the standard economist position on these issues based on those theories that we have studied. There is a third policy implication. The third policy implication is about the incidence of tax. So there are these two diagrams. The first one is about parking spaces. Now in parking spaces, you have a fairly inelastic supply So what happens? So what do? You put a tax on these. So there are people who have garages and they let people park their cars in them and they charge them prices. Now we put a tax on this. So what's going to happen? Well, because the supply is inelastic, so the price is going to rise. The demand is fairly flexible. People will stop parking. So the demand is very elastic. So if the price rises a little bit from 6 rupees to 7 rupees, the demand will change a lot. It will go down from 500 parking spaces to 400 parking spaces. The revenue that the part that is paid by the producer of parking spaces will be a lot, because their demand is inelastic. So they will actually, the benefit, if you look at the squares, the portion A, which is the big square, is the loss to the producer. This is the part of the tax that is paid by the producer, and the small square is the part that is paid by the consumer. So basically this says that if the supply is inelastic, then the suppliers will pay most of the tax, and some portion will be, they will not be able to shift the tax onto the consumer, because if they try to shift, then they will lose the demand, because the demand is flexible. On the other hand, the other is the demand for milk. Here the supply is relatively elastic and the demand is inelastic. So the reverse happens. Now if the tax is put on the price of milk, then they will be able to shift most of it to the consumer, and they will take only a small portion of it for themselves. So this is an analysis of what happens when taxation is done in these markets. So there are these three policy implications that we derive from this supply and demand. There are many others, but I'm following Hill and Myatt, so these are the three policy implications that he looks at. So it turns out that the incidence of tax depends on basically it's very simple formula. You have two elasticities, elasticity of supply, elasticity of demand. So how much tax the consumers pay, the proportion will be elasticity of supply divided by ES plus ED, and the producers will pay ED over ES plus ED. So it's just divided in proportion according to their elasticities. Whoever is less flexible, he gets to pay more tax, and whoever is more flexible, he gets to pay less tax. The total adds to 1, and this is the proportion of the split. So now we step back from the textbooks. Instead of studying textbooks, we look at the meta level. What is happening here? So what is happening here is that economics is not a scientific theory, it is rhetoric. This is a famous position by McCloskey, I think, yes, a famous economist who had a sex change operation. So now we call her a she. When I was studying, it was a he. So she has written a book when she was a he about the economics as rhetoric, and she has explained how economics is really the art of how to persuade people. So what we are doing by this theory is we are trying to persuade you that free markets work very well, and that there are many people who are well-meaning but stupid people. They do things to try to help the poor, but they end up hurting them. So you have to be smart. However, one very amazing thing about this rhetoric, these economists are very good at rhetoric. They have persuaded you about all of this without presenting any empirical evidence. They haven't explained that in New York this happened and that happened, and they haven't explained about how rent controls worked in Toronto. All they did was they drew some graphs on pieces of paper and they said, here is the result and you should believe this, and you believed it. You are convinced. So this is really called master of art of rhetoric. Without any empirical evidence, they have proven to you very powerful things. Tomorrow, if there is a coalition of people who are striking and they say that we would like to have minimum wages, and you are going to say no, you are just foolish people. I realize you are good intentioned and all, and you want to help the poor, and you are maybe laborers and you want a higher wage, but actually if we pass this law, it's going to hurt you. That's what you're going to tell them. One, you have not seen a single study of what minimum wage does in the real world. You have no empirical evidence for this. So basically, soft power is exactly the power of ideology, the power of rhetoric, the power of ideas. We have convinced you of something, and Karl Marx was very aware of the importance of this. He said that if you want to enslave the masses, if you want to make 90% of the people your slaves and you want to make them work for low wages, then it is not, you can't do it by having the rod, by whip. That's very difficult to do. It can be done, but it requires a lot of effort and very difficult. The real power is that you have to make the worker come to believe in the necessity of his own enslavement to work. So you have to make the laborers believe that low wages are good for them, high wages are bad for them. The advance of the capitalist production depends on a working class which, by education, very important, tradition and habit, looks upon the requirements of that mode of production as self-evident natural laws. This is the law. This is the economic law of supply and demand. There's nothing you can do about it, nothing I can do about it. This is the way it has to be. Workers have to have low wages. They can't get high wages, otherwise that's against the law, natural law. So what do the textbooks teach? How do the textbook achieve this goal of persuasion when in fact it's not true? Well, one very interesting trick which you can easily find out is that they say, the textbook, that the supply and demand model is universally applicable. It applies to all markets. So here is a quote from Colander. The range of these, you start by studying the supply and demand model and you put it at the beginning of the text. It's chapter 1 in Varian and it's chapter 3 in other leading texts. So basically you start with this supply and demand model, and you explain that, and then you analyze, okay, the market for oranges, the market for refrigerators, the market for cars, everything. So the way you apply it, you tell the student that this applies to all markets. So even though you mention that, look, there is an assumption here and an assumption there, but when you come to illustrate the theory, you never mention that there is any limitation. You apply it as if it applies to everything. So Colander says that supply and demand provides a good off-the-cuff, a quick analysis of any economic question. You take any economic question and you can use supply and demand to analyze it. But is this true? Well, no. It's quite clear that supply and demand only works with perfect competition. Some texts admit this parenthetically. Krugman and Wells say that supply and demand we have introduced in chapter 3. In chapter 9 they are telling you it only works, is a model of a perfectly competitive market. Doesn't work outside perfect. But from chapter 3 to chapter 9 they have been using it to study everything, never telling you that this is actually a very restricted choice. So the supply and demand is applied to all markets. So students come to believe that supply and demand applies to all markets. So this is a rhetorical strategy. We say, okay, here's assumption 1, assumption 2, assumption 3. This leads to supply and demand model. Now we apply it, but in applying we never check if the assumptions hold. And we sort of imply without actually saying that the assumptions don't matter, or that they hold in every market, or that they hold to a sufficient approximation. We never actually discuss it. So the student comes to believe that that supply and demand applies in all markets. And there is no other analysis. What if the market is not competitive? Supply and demand doesn't work. Then what happens? No one tells you in those textbooks. So you again believe that supply and demand is the only way to think about price. Now, actually, supply and demand model is completely wrong. It doesn't work at all. The supply curve only exists if the firms are price takers. See, how do you make the supply curve? You say, okay, if the market price is X, what are you going to offer? If the market price is Y, that's how you make the supply curve. But if the firm says, no, there is no market price, I'm going to set my own price, then where's the supply curve? There's no supply curve. I set the price, then there is no function of price, because I am determining the price. So, the monopoly, yes.
So, is it the supply curve is determined by the marginal cost?
That's in perfect competition.
So, it still exists in the imperfect competition?
No, not in imperfect. In imperfect competition, in a monopoly, there is no supply curve. You look at any textbook. If you have a monopoly, there is no supply curve. Or if you have oligopoly, there is no supply curve.
Isn't the marginal cost of supply curve?
In a perfectly competitive market. This is exactly the illusion that the textbooks foster in students. The marginal cost curve is the supply curve in a perfectly competitive market, and not otherwise. In otherwise, it doesn't exist. But textbooks have fooled you into thinking that this is a general picture of all markets, whereas it is not true. So this is a diagram from a book that how many producers are there? There can be many. That's perfect competition. And if the products are all homogeneous. So these two conditions are necessary for perfect competition. If the products are differentiated, like toothpaste, you have many different types, brands, then you have monopolistic competition. If you have a few producers, or if you have one producer, you have oligopoly, monopoly. So in these 6 cases, there is only one in which there is perfect competition. And all the others, there is no supply curve. Also, I'll explain that there is no demand curve, but that's not in the Hill and Myatt material, so I'm not doing it right now. But also the demand curve is not correct, and this is called the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu theorem. What basically they showed is that demand curve may be valid for one person, but if you aggregate demand curves, then anything can happen. It doesn't have to have any of the properties that one individual demand curve has. So this is so when you can argue about demand curve by saying, okay, one individual can have a demand curve, but if you aggregate, you take the aggregate demand, then there is no property that the demand function has. So neither the supply curve exists nor the demand curve exists. So which markets satisfy perfect competition? That's the only market in which the supply and demand works. According to the textbooks, this is a rare situation. Textbooks take different positions on this. Some textbooks, like Blinder and Baumol, they say that it is very rare. You don't find markets which are operating under perfect competition in the real world. Some textbooks say that many markets do, without being very clear on which markets. Some textbooks give the illustration that Agriculture is a good case. So if you have rice, you have wheat. These are homogeneous products. If you're looking at raw materials, gold, silver, etc., these are products which are homogeneous, and they are sold by many producers, and there are many consumers. So this is perfectly competitive. Well, if you look at these conditions, in the USA, this is about 2 or 3% of the market. So 97% of the market does not satisfy these conditions. So then one would think that economics textbooks would discuss other things. But this is the central model in all textbooks. The central model that you are taught is this portion of the economy which is at most 2 to 3% of the economy. Why? Now we are asking a meta question. Why do textbooks focus on supply and demand when this is only 2 to 3% of the economy in the USA? And so 97% of the economy is governed by monopoly or by oligopoly or by monopolistic competition, which is the Chamberlain and Robinson theory, which is there. So, as I said, your theory, the textbook theory, develops all of these policies without looking at a single piece of empirical evidence. As we said, the behavioral economists who look at real world are not part of your classical economic theory, and the textbooks never talk about real world. Blinder is an economist, and he made a survey. So he made a study of real firms. Unlike your textbooks, we don't study real firms. They just draw diagrams on a piece of paper and study mathematics. Blinder actually went out and studied real firms. So he writes that sticky prices are the rule, not the exception. Now, according to the standard theory of economics, the prices are continuously adjusting to costs and to supply and demand conditions. But actually, he finds that firms, all of them set prices, and typically they have only annual reviews. Every year they review the price and then they set it. So they don't watch what is happening to the price in the middle. If the demand increases or if it decreases, the price remains the same. So about 10% of the prices are changed weekly, and about 7% of the firms have weekly price reviews. So this is just one piece of evidence. There is a huge number of other evidences that the firms are not, that the firms, most of the firms that we see in the world are not perfectly competitive firms. They don't satisfy any of the many conditions required. They don't have the information, they don't have homogeneity, the products are diversified, they're trying to diversify products, and so on. So, at the very least, monopolistic competition is the model, but in the monopolistic competition model, there's no supply and demand. At least not the type of theory that you have been studying. So then the question is perfect competition a useful approximation? Some textbooks do take this position. They say that, okay, it is true that the world is not perfectly competitive. We have a lot of oligopolies, but the oligopolistic analysis is very complicated. So instead of doing that, let's just do perfect competition. It will provide us with a useful approximation. Most textbooks ignore this issue. They don't discuss it because it's too uncomfortable. So let's look at that. Does perfect competition provide us with a good approximation to what happens in the real world? So first, the most important policy implication is that if you introduce minimum wages which are above the equilibrium, that will reduce unemployment. So I have a lecture on this last semester, which shows that Keynes was the first to understand that labor market doesn't work by supply and demand, and it is not true that an increase in wages will reduce unemployment. But what Keynes said was never understood. Not even Samuelson understood what he did. And so the same old theory, the classical theory, which was rejected by Keynes, came back and is currently found in all textbooks. So there was no increase in understanding due to Keynes. But most recently, in 1980s and 90s, some very solid orthodox neoclassical economists studied this question: does increasing minimum wage lead to increase? And they found that increasing minimum wage led to increased employment. And this is a very simple experiment. They looked at two states which are bordering each other. They looked at the fast food industry, in which they were hiring people who were just fresh. So there is no heterogeneity of labor, all unskilled labor. Anybody can come in and get a job as a fast food restaurant operator, cooking hamburgers. So the wage rate in one state, they raised it, the minimum to $5.40. In the other state, it was $4 or something. So immediately you have a very nice experiment, because these two states are across from each other, very near. You can go to one or you can go to the other for eating your hamburgers. And there are similar conditions. So one would predict that in the state which had the higher minimum wage, the employment would decline. But actually the reverse happened. The employment increased. And he explains why this could be so, why Card and Kruger explained. But Card and Kruger were, they lost friends. They wrote an interview that many people had bitter fights with us. They said that you're betraying the cause of economics by writing this. So it shows that this is not about theory, this is about an ideology which is being. So now, yes.
Why would fast food companies hire more people?
Why? There is a whole book by Card and Kruger. You read that and they will give you the explanation on this particular issue. So, among economists, consensus on this issue of minimum wage has decreased. If you look at in the 1980s, you find that nearly all economists, 90%, believe that if you increase the minimum wage, it will cause reduction in employment. But slowly, because this Card and Kruger study is very convincing, economists have reduced their belief in this, and textbooks have also responded to this by taking this application out. Some textbooks mention that there is some controversy about it and then ignore it. But nearly all textbooks say that, okay, supply and demand is the only model. And even if it is violated by real world, they continue to use it. Just like the utility maximization theory is contradicted by consumer behavior, and it's very easy to prove that this is the case. And if you look at actually there's a book, not one book, there are many textbooks called Consumer Theory in business school, where they teach really about how consumers behave. And some of them discuss the economic model and dismiss it, that the economists have a model for this, but this model doesn't work for us. So just mention it in the passing, and then we go on to realistic models of consumer behavior. So the point is that the real world is directly in conflict with what you are taught in economics textbooks. But and the economists have become aware of this. They know that the behavioral economists are are showing that human behavior does not match what our theories say, but they have not changed the theory. The textbook continue to teach the same thing. What about rent controls? Again, there is a study about real-world rent controls, which have been in place in Montreal, in New York, in many other cities. So you can go and study what happened. Was there shortage of housing? Was all of the predictions that we discussed, have these things happened? You can go and find out. So he says that, well, the rent control is a very small factor in the housing market. There are many other very complicated things going on, and so trying to find out what rent control does is very difficult, and it's not a big factor. There are many other things which matter. And also, rent controls are not that simple that you set a price. Actually, you have first generation rent controls which just set prices. Then there were second generation rent controls in which you said, okay, nearly all of them, if you build new housing, rent control don't apply to that. So this idea that, no new housing will be built is not true. And then you have third generation rent controls in which you try to take care of all of these problems that are supposed to be created and do it in a sophisticated way. So basically you can't find any effect of rent control in empirical studies because it's too small. There are too many other factors. On the other hand, with textbooks, there are no other factors mentioned, and there is a very strong message that rent controls are very damaging to the renters. Why? Because this is ideology. This is not reality. So again, we think about the meta theory. We think about why textbooks carry this message that rent control is very harmful, when in fact there is no empirical evidence to prove this in the real world. So this is a question about what is being taught. So basically, this is again the person who did this study, Arnott. He discusses why, and this theory, this empirical evidence is not mentioned in the textbooks. They continue to say that rent control is very harmful. So why? One is ideological. This rent control is a battleground between those people who are in favor of free markets and those people who are against. And so basically the ideology, there is an ideology which says that free markets are always best. This doesn't matter. I mean, this doesn't require, an ideology doesn't require empirical evidence. In fact, you give them any type of empirical evidence and they will come up with a counter argument, and they do. That, okay, you're saying this, but the reality is that. And so in this, also the free market ideology is extremely favorable to capitalists. This has been so since the beginning, but basically Karl Marx said is that capitalism is a system in which the capitalists exploit laborers. So neoclassical theory, one of the key components of this is the theory of the production function, which you have been taught, which says that the laborer gets the marginal product of labor and the capitalist gets the marginal product of capital. Even though this theory is completely false and has been proven wrong, this continues to be taught. And basically what you are teaching, it seems to you, the student, that you are learning some formulas, some calculus. But what you are actually being taught, the subtext, the message, is that the market is just. It provides the labor with what he produces and it provides the capitalist with what he produces, and both get a fair share. And this is a counter to what Marx said. What Marx said is that no, the capitalists exploit the laborers. Now the question is, are you going to believe calculus or are you going to believe the evidence of your eyes in the real world? This is the job of rhetoric. Good rhetoric is one in which you deny your own experience, your knowledge of the world and your observation, and you say, yes, amanna saddaqna. Partial of f of kl with respect to k is equal to w. And that is the truth. And what I see in the real world about the poor wage laborers being exploited by the capital, my eyes are deceiving me. and I have Iman in the unseen truth which the economics text is teaching me. So this is the ideological battleground in which the economics textbooks are teaching you one ideology without mentioning it. And the second is the methodological battleground. Again, is supply and demand a useful tool? It turns out that, as what I have been arguing in this lecture and what Hill and Myatt are telling you, that the supply and demand is not a useful tool because it only applies to perfectly competitive markets, and there are very few of those in the real world. I would be willing to say that even on those it doesn't work, but we don't need to consider that because basically the world is not perfectly competitive. So let's study a theory which works for the real world instead of studying a theory which works for the imaginary world of perfect competition. Now, the empirical evidence is emerging, and Arnott concludes that among the younger generation, the new economists who have been exposed to this, probably most would agree that a well-designed rent control program can be beneficial to everybody. Basically, you look at the other side. You have seen what would rent control do? Well, basically, you see if a family is living in a house, they are at the mercy of the landlord. I mean, if the landlord raises rent, then for them it's very costly to shift. So he can exploit their dependence. As long as the market conditions are good, it is possible. So rent control can, basically there is this market power that the landlord has. What the economic theory says is that no, the landlord is a price taker. He doesn't have any power to change the price. So since he doesn't have power to change the price, obviously he cannot exploit. Now, is this true? Does the landlord have no power to change prices? Well, we all know from experience this is not true. If the landlord has power, then if he has market power, then it's not a perfectly competitive market. And then he can exploit. And therefore, it is possible to design laws which would prevent exploitation. Okay, you can charge a little bit more, but it should be maximum what the market. This is what the New York law is, that if the rate of change of prices is around 6%, then you cannot raise rents by more than 6%. It's very logical and very reasonable. It prevents the market, the owner from exploiting the renter in an unequal relationship. The landlord and the tenant don't have an equal relationship. That they are both, the tenant is much weaker position, landlord is in a much stronger position. So you can counter that power. But the theory that you have learned says that there doesn't exist any power. So you can't even talk about this because the market power is outside the scope of discussion. If we talked about monopolistic competition, then these factors could come in because you can see that if you have an oligopoly, the firms have market power. So these things are not discussed very much in textbooks. What about the incidence of taxation? These are the three major real-world implications that neoclassical theories have. Well, what Myatt says in his anti-textbooks is that, okay, so basically textbooks don't really present evidence about minimal wages and rent controls, but about the incidence of sales taxes, there is no evidence at all. Why? Because if there is no supply curve, then there can be this analysis doesn't work. If you remember correct, that the incidence of tax depends on the proportion between elasticity of supply and elasticity of demand. But if there is no supply, then this analysis just completely breaks down. So this is a quote from Myatt saying that if you look at, he looks at text, so we are doing a meta-analysis, we are looking at what is being taught in textbooks. So he says that most of the textbooks don't mention the market, but the markets that are mentioned for incidence of tax analysis, some of them mention cigarettes. So this is a very oligopolistic industry. There are 6 producers. So obviously the perfectly competitive supply and demand analysis will not work in the cigarette industry in USA. So why not, if you're going to talk about taxidence, why don't you talk about how tax works in an oligopoly? It can be done. But no, you're going to ignore the oligopoly situation, because in this situation the firms have market power. They are able to pass the tax on, whereas when you don't have market power, you can't. Again, there are other kinds of industries which are mentioned in examples. All of these are wrong examples, and there are no real examples that are given in textbooks. So economics textbooks are teaching ideology by using rhetoric, and basically the goal of the textbooks is to get you to accept the reality of this world, that you are poor, you are living in an underdeveloped country, and this is the way it ought to be. And those who are rich because they have earned their wealth, because the capital has a marginal product and they are earning it and it is justified. And those who have only labor to sell, they are only justified in getting what they can earn with their labor, the marginal product. They are not justified. There is no justification to give them anything more. If we try to help them, we will actually end up hurting them. Now I want to show you one demo. Alright, so this is a model where the white dots are sheep, and there are also black dots, I don't know exactly. And the green is the grass. So the sheep are eating the grass. They are moving at random. This is evolutionary agent-based modeling. We are trying to find out what happens. The sheep eat the grass. The grass will regrow if it is given enough time. So you see here, the sheep have eliminated all the one area has turned blue. There is no grass, and they are eating up all the grass that is remaining. Now what happens is that, what's going to happen? Well, according to the equilibrium theory, you see, the sheep will eat up all the grass, then they will all die because there is no grass, and that's equilibrium. No grass, no sheep. But actually what happens is, this is called a predator-prey model, and this is a standard, you have a differential equation model. So there is an equilibrium. This is an equilibrium. All sheep die, no grass, that is an equilibrium. But, or actually when you have no grass, then the grass will regrow, and so there's an equilibrium with all grass and no sheep. But there is no equilibrium with all sheep and no grass, because the sheep need grass. Now, what happens in reality in this model is that when the grass becomes small, then the sheep start to die. You see how the large the circle is. The fat circles are the ones which are big sheep, and the thin circles are the sheep which are not getting any grass, and eventually they just blink out of existence. They die. You can see them slowly die as they don't find any grass. So when the sheep start dying, then the grass starts growing again. And so basically you have this cycle where you have lots of grass, few sheep, and then the sheep expand and expand and expand. The grass goes down and down and down until there's not enough not enough grass for the sheep, and so then you have the sheep start dying out and the grass starts growing again. So what I wanted to say is that if you want to do an equilibrium analysis for this, you don't understand anything about it. And this is exactly what our economic system is like. It is not driven by equilibrium, it is driven by a dynamic law which, the equilibrium acts as an attractor. One equilibrium where you have all the grass is gone and only sheep are left. This is a position towards which the system moves, but then when it moves, gets near it, then this is a repeller. This is one of the repeller, and so when you get close to it, the system pushes you away from this equilibrium. And so then the sheep start dying, the grass starts growing, and until you get to a situation with few sheep and lots of grass, and then the cycle repeats. So this is what dynamical systems theory tells us. It tells us that this equilibrium idea, that we can understand a system by studying its equilibria, this idea is wrong. It doesn't work. And so variance starts by saying that we will study optimization and equilibrium. Then already you can say that we can throw this book in the garbage, because the economic system is so complex that the equilibria will not, the system will never be in equilibrium. It will be, so we have to study disequilibrium in order to understand what is going on. Now, the supply and demand model is also an example of the failure of equilibrium, in the sense that the supply and demand model doesn't make any sense outside of equilibrium. You see, suppose you are in disequilibrium. What in a disequilibrium, suppose you have a high level of wage which is above the equilibrium. Let's look at a simple market like market for housing. So you have a situation where you have excess supply or excess demand of some good. Suppose you have excess supply. Then the producers are supposed to lower prices. However, what they might do is they might say that, okay, we are not selling goods, so let's just dispose of what is in our inventory and not produce anymore. Why not? They think that the price is not going to change, and they don't want to change prices. As we have seen already, prices don't change very often. So they say, okay, here's the price at which the things are being sold, and we can't sell our goods, so let's just drop this line. So the idea that there is going to be an excess supply is not true, because the outside of equilibrium, how the supply will behave, we haven't said. We have made some assumptions about it, but this assumption is not verified by reality. So basically, in fact, there is something which is called Arrow's paradox. He asks, that in the competitive model, all people are price takers. The suppliers are price takers, and then who sets the prices, and how do the prices change? There's nobody there. So that's what the Walrasian auctioneer does. He calls out the prices and he sets them. Otherwise, a competitive market can't work like it is said to work. So there are all of these problems with the classical theory, and